Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cap Times Idea Fest 2022 on our session on 50 years later, how Title IX has shaped women's sports. I'm especially interested to get into some of the notions of women athletes and administrators as political actors through their very existence. We have a tremendous group of panelists with us today, really distinguished folks. First of all, my name is Andrew Marinus, and I am the Director of Special Projects at the Vanderbilt University Athletic Department in Nashville, Tennessee. And I also write books on sports and history and social justice issues for teenagers and adults. My latest book will be coming out on September 13th. It's called Inaugural Ballers, and it's the story of the first U.S. women's Olympic basketball team, which played at the 1976 Olympics in Montreal. Benita and I were speaking before we got started here today, and she was friends with one of the players on that team, a well-known figure in basketball, Pat Head, as she was known at the time, Pat Summitt, one of the legendary coaches in women's basketball history. But let's get to our speakers. So we've got Doug Moe, who is no stranger to Madison audiences. Doug is a longtime journalist and author in Madison. He was the editor of Madison Magazine and has written more than a dozen books. I'm way behind you. I've written 5, so I'm trying to catch up to you, including most recently, The Right Thing to Do, Kit Saunders-Nordine and the Rise of Women's Intercollegiate Athletics at the University of Wisconsin and beyond. So, Doug, thank you for being with us. I know you just interviewed my dad, so you're probably getting tired of the Marinus family here.
Can't have enough Marinuses.
All right. And then joining us from Virginia is Benita Fitzgerald-Mosley, who's an Olympic gold medalist, 100-meter hurdles in 1984, and president of Fund Play. The program is part of League Apps, an organization designed to empower youth sports organizers. Mosley connects professional sports leagues with youth development programs. Benita, it's an honor to have an Olympic gold medalist with us today. And then finally, thank you. From San Diego, but originally from Wisconsin, we have Judy Sweet, who is the co-founder of the Alliance of Women's Coaches, a native of Milwaukee and a UW-Madison alum. Judy is the former president of the NCAA, the first woman ever to hold that title, and was the athletic director for the University of California, San Diego for 24 years. She currently does Title IX consulting work, and I'm sure in this 50th anniversary of Title IX, you've been pretty busy with that, Judy. So again, thanks to the three of you for being with us today. First question, I wanted to go back to your childhoods. And Doug, I'll ask you a slightly different version of the question, but Benita, I'll get started with you. When you think back to your youth, what were the moments that really steered you on a path toward becoming involved in athletics, whether recreationally or truly competitively? Was there a person that steered you in that direction, or just sort of an innate desire you had to compete? What was it that really got you started?
I was I am the daughter of 2 educators, and they both really emphasize not only being good in class, but also being good in exploring other aspects and extracurricular activities. And so they introduced me to all kinds of things, music and sports, but it was not till 12th grade, 12 years old, 7th grade. My PE teacher was also the gymnastics coach and the track coach, and I happened to be on the gymnastics team. And for those of you who knows me, Judy knows I'm 5'10", and not gymnast material even back then. Wasn't very good at it. Scored 4s and 5s on my routines out of scale of 1 to 10. But Gwen Washington was an astute, coach and cared a lot about her kids, and she put me on the team anyway. I had a lot of fun. But one day she just came up to me at practice and she said, you beat all the boys, and I see you in PE class. You should come out for the track team. I always liken it to redirecting a toddler when they're getting into trouble and you want them to do something else, a new bright, shiny object. So she threw the new bright, shiny object in front of me of track and field. I got out there and won all my races the first time out, and the rest, as they say, is history.
It's interesting you mentioned, there was already a team. There was already a woman administrator at the school steering you in that direction. So, in doing the research for my book about these 76 Olympians, many of them grew up in environments where they were told, you don't ever race against a boy. And if you do, you certainly don't beat them, or that's going to be bad for his ego, or there weren't teams for girls at their school. So did you feel any sense of that social pressure not to compete as an athlete, or was it the opposite?
Absolutely not. No, our country, our county, Prince William County is the second largest county in the country. And short story, my mom was one of 4 teachers to integrate the public school system here in Northern Virginia. And so they were more progressive, I think, than some other school systems. And by the time I got to high school, my freshman year, our team had already won 3 straight track and field state championships. And we won a 4th straight my freshman year. So there was not only the sports there, but a legacy of excellence in our schools where I grew up. And so our basketball team won the state championship. Our gymnastics team in high school won the state championships, all, by the way, helmed by the same coach. So she was an amazing motivator and coach, Ann Lockett. So yeah, very, very fortunate to have all of the opportunities in music and sports and education at my disposal. And it didn't hurt that my dad was my guidance counselor.
That's great. And Judy, how about you growing up in Milwaukee? When did you fall in love with sports, and what was the environment around you in terms of, whether that was quote unquote appropriate, for you to become involved in?
Well, I'm going to date myself. Benita, post Title IX. I'm pre-Title IX. So there weren't a whole lot of opportunities that were available or enthusiastically supported. I was fortunate to have 3 male cousins who were very good in sports and always included me. I was the only girl on the playground with them, or in the alley, or in the street, in the days that you could do those kinds of things. And it never was a gender issue. In high school, sadly, there were no real organized sports opportunities for girls. We had the Girls Athletic Association, which basically no coaching. You would go to a play day or a sports day. You'd mix up the teams. You wouldn't even play with the same people from your school. You really didn't practice for this event. You'd play the game, and then you'd have punch and cookies. So now we graduate from high school, and I'm off to the University of Wisconsin. And as we all know, fairly progressive university. However, no women's athletics programs. There was the Women's Recreation Association, and note the word recreation. It wasn't athletics. It was kind of taboo to say athletics associated with girls and women. There was a stigma about that. So again, we had to create our own opportunities. And fortunately, as Doug knows, Kit Saunders was a big part of making that happen for those of us who were interested in continuing to play sports. We would go to sports days. We'd have to do our own fundraising to get there. One of our fundraisers was chopping down Christmas trees. The best part was the hot chocolate afterward, and we would sell the Christmas trees on campus to the other students. We would pile in a university station wagon, which was pretty dilapidated, and off we would go. We didn't have meal money. We didn't have transportation money. We didn't have uniforms, but somehow we made it work. And I really think that my interest in sports goes back to my cousins, as I mentioned, as well as the fact that the environment in Wisconsin, how could you not love sports in Wisconsin when you have the Packers and at that time the Braves and the Bucks? It was just part of my DNA.
I want to make sure that the listeners understand the stories you're telling about the play dates and the cookies and punch and fundraisers was common all over the country. You were experiencing there in Wisconsin, but I've read about the great basketball teams at Immaculata College in the early 1970s, competing for national championships, selling toothbrushes, to raise enough money to get their team to the tournament. Pat Summitt talked about having to sew, they were supposed to sew their jersey numbers on their uniform. She didn't know how to sew, so she just did it with like a clip of some kind. Women who really were super competitive and didn't have the chance, like you said, they would mix up the players from both schools, so that they intentionally were not competitive against another university. I mean, did you just have this sense inside of you that this is wrong and needs to change from the very beginning, or was there any part of you like accepted it at the beginning? This is just the way things are, and you gradually came to realize, no, this is not right.
I knew it wasn't right, but I didn't know what to do about it. Step into Title IX. So that was after I graduated from the University of Wisconsin. And now there's this federal law that is affirming what I knew should be right. So that gave us the leverage to emphasize the opportunities that are available to our sons and brothers should be available to our daughters and our sisters. And that's really what Title IX is about. Would one gender be willing to accept the opportunities and support of the other gender, and vice versa? And at that point in time, girls and women would have been delighted to accept what opportunities and support the males had, but not the reverse.
Absolutely. Doug, so thinking about men or when you were a boy, and perceptions that boys may have had about girls involved in athletics of your generation, thinking about that from your own perspective, what do you remember about, what opportunities girls had, or what you might have thought and your friends might have thought of girl athletes as a kid?
Well, it's interesting, Andrew. I can barely remember girls playing sports, to be honest with you. I played, pretty sandlot baseball and some organized sports in junior high and high school. It just wasn't on my radar. And, I can say with some embarrassment, I don't know that I've mentioned this in all the work I've promoting my book I've done, but early in my college career, with Title IX, I wrote a Badger Herald, University of Wisconsin newspaper column questioning Title IX and saying, I'm not sure, that this is right. So I think I came a little late to the game, and I hope I'm doing some penance now with this book, and I've come to realize just how bad it was. I mean, Judy outlined some of it, and you did too, Andrew. Just amazing. Kit Saunders used to talk about musical warm-ups. They didn't have enough warm-ups for their teams in the late 60s, early 70s. The coaches would have to do laundry in between events and get the uniforms, and certainly no priority on facilities. In my interviewing for the book, it was interesting how many of the athletes would talk about their daughters who are now in sports, or granddaughters in some instances, and how they were just shocked and stunned and couldn't believe what their mothers and grandmothers had done simply to play. I mean, they weren't asking for that much.
And Doug, what did you learn this question about, early influences about Kit's life and how she became interested in athletics, and what type of support or lack of support did she receive as a young girl?
Her mom was a big influence on her. But as Judy said, there just weren't very many opportunities in high school, the play days, those sorts of things. So she actually went outside into she was from New Jersey, and they had some, was it AAU or club type sports where she could play lacrosse and field hockey. And the coaches would get, or the Phi Ed teachers would get mad at her when she'd come back with scraped knees from a field hockey game. What are you doing? So, I think Kit in an interview said, we really didn't have many role models because they just weren't there. They were the pioneers.
That's right. Yeah, that's something that all the women on the 76 Olympic team would have said also. I mean, there had never been a women's Olympic basketball team. There were no basketball scholarships. There was no WNBA. So the role models they looked up to in terms of basketball were typically men, unless they happened to have an older sister that was good in the backyard, but really hadn't had any organized opportunities. Judy, coming to you, when you were named athletic director at UCSD, I believe at age 27, right? 1975, yep. This period between when Title IX was signed into law, but really just as its very beginnings of being implemented at universities around the country. First of all, how did you put yourself in position to get that job? Who had confidence to hire a young woman in that job? And then I understand that the reaction from many men was quite hateful. And I wondered if you could tell us about that reception that you received when you were named athletic director.
Sure. My timing for being an athlete was not very good. My timing for being an administrator in athletics was much better. I have often been asked, did being appointed athletics director fulfill a lifelong dream? And the reality is, not in my wildest dreams could I have anticipated that for all the things we've talked about. There were no role models. There were no women that were in athletic administrator roles overseeing a combined men's and women's program. It's important to keep in mind that at this time, you had a separate men's athletics program and you had a women's recreation association. And the Women's Recreation Association that grew into the Women's Athletics Association was overseen by a woman. And of course, men's athletics program had a male athletic director. So UCSD was really on the cutting edge when they were willing to do something that hadn't been done before, appointing a female to oversee a combined men's and women's athletics program. And I knew that being the first was a matter of timing, but the most important thing to me was to not be the last. I knew that I needed to be successful so that it wasn't used as an excuse. See what happens when we appoint a woman? Everything falls apart. How did I get there? I had been at the university for 2 prior years. First year I was coaching and teaching. The second year I became assistant athletic director. And the third year, the athletics director stepped down. And I was fortunate enough to be selected to oversee the combined program. How was that received? Very mixed. Needless to say, there were people who felt that I was taking away a job from men, and that was inappropriate. I'm so glad that the internet didn't exist then, because I can only imagine how that would have lit up, because I received so many handwritten letters. People actually wrote letters at that time. And some of them were very complimentary and wished me well. Others were, go back to the kitchen where you belong. Furman Busher, who was a noted writer for the Atlantic paper, when I became president of the NCAA, said, having a female in charge of the NCAA is like having a woman in charge of the Mule Skinners Association. And that was kind of the reaction to doing something different. Having somebody who was a non-traditional candidate overseeing a traditional program.
Oh, when you're the first, there's really, almost by definition, no one that you can turn to for support in a situation like that. Like, how did you deal with it? How did you persevere?
I knew it was important. I'm stubborn enough and persistent enough that I wasn't going to let the criticism and those that were trying to pull me down get away with that. It was really that easy. And I did have colleagues, mainly female, some male, but mainly female, who at least I could vent to. And I always had to make sure that I showed a strong persona.
Benita, there's something that Judy mentioned. This is a little bit off of my planned questions, but it's significant that Judy was named athletic director over an entire department. She wasn't the women's athletic director, but I know at University of Tennessee, where you went to school, there's a great deal of pride in the Lady Vols brand and the fact that there has been a separation historically between the men's side and the women's side of that athletic department. In what ways did you feel like that separation, supported the development of women's sports at UT?
I think the brand speaks for itself. I think the fact that the Lady Vol brand is so prominent, that all of the teams at University of Tennessee at one time or other have been quite prominent and, nationally ranked or won national championships. The facilities there for women's athletics are amazing. A separate, women's softball stadium and women's soccer stadium. And every time I go back, I marvel at just how much support the athletes get, but in particular, the women athletes. Joan Cronin, when she retired, she became, I think, athletic director emeritus or something. And I see her every once in a while. But before her, Gloria Ray, when I first got there to University of Tennessee. And both of them ran a tight ship, but they availed to the athletes and coaches within the women's athletic department all of the benefits and all of the resources that we needed to be successful. During spring break and Christmas break, we traveled to different track meets as a team. I never felt, we'd go to Penn Relays for 4 days or national championships. We'd have a uniform for every day. Not that they, wasted money, but I never felt like we were second-class citizens by any stretch of the imagination. The women's athletic department controlled their own budget, raised their own money. And, with Joan at the helm in particular, she was a prolific fundraiser and just did an amazing job keeping that program at the top. And so when you then had our team win a national championship my sophomore year, the first Lady Vols, and then, of course, Pat in the women's Lady Vols, we were able to set the bar pretty high. And then all the other coaches wanted to follow suit. And they just kept pouring resources into women's athletics at Tennessee to ensure that was possible for the other athletes and teams as well. So no, I don't think there were any, negatives in having a separate women's athletics department. In fact, I think it was very much a positive and enriched my experience as a student athlete.
Okay. Doug, when you researched the period where Title IX is being implemented at the University of Wisconsin, what was the environment that existed in there, the type of opposition or obstacles that she encountered, and what was her approach to either working around or, overcoming those obstacles?
Yeah, I think it's important, Andrew, to note that although it passed in 1972, it would really be a mistake to view Title IX as a panacea immediately. At Wisconsin, the chancellor set up a committee to look at women's athletics. How can we improve things? The committee met once in 8 months. And in fact, a faculty member wrote a letter that I quote in the book, saying this committee is essentially a joke. It got a little bit better. Kit was in an interesting spot because she definitely held the view that Title IX should be implemented immediately, but she worked inside the athletic department. So, and her personality was not one of, in your face. She was more kind of a quiet, but very strong-willed individual. They set up a varsity program for women in '74 at Wisconsin, and she was named athletic director, 11 sports. The budget got bigger and bigger as the '70s progressed. But once again, you've got to realize in 1979, famously in Madison, the women's crew team one morning went to the male athletic director's office, Elroy Hirsch, and changed clothes outside his office door, from their street clothes to their workout clothes, because they didn't have a locker room. Mm-hmm. And, that's 79, that's 7 years post Title IX. So, and then, as time goes on, Title IX has other challenges. Just 5 years after that, there's a famous court decision, Grove City College, where the Supreme Court pretty much took the teeth out of Title IX and said, the language is if the university receives federal funds, you can't discriminate. Well, this Supreme Court decision said, no, it's a program issue. In other words, if your program receives federal funds, then you can't discriminate. So in Grove City, they got Pell Grants, but their athletics didn't get any money. So, for several years, then Title IX was kind of lost its teeth, although in 1988, a new law was written. And even though President Reagan vetoed it, if you can imagine, the Congress had enough votes, bipartisan, to override Reagan's veto, and Title IX was back. So
okay,
that's a little history.
Yeah. Benita, I wanted to go back to something you mentioned about growing up, and I read about this in another interview you did about running against boys as a kid. Every time you beat them, they'd change the rules on you, right? Like, well, you're running in shoes, so we got to run without shoes, or let's change the distance or
Yeah,
something.
they did. It was on my street when I was growing up. Absolutely. Nearby where I am now in Manassas, Virginia. The twins across the street, they're Howard twins. They had 6 or 8 kids in their family, and all those boys. I think they just had one girl. Stacy was the youngest. I can't believe that. And we'd be out there doing foot races in the street, and I'd beat those boys, and then they'd figure out some other way. Well, such and such, or such, making up excuses, and like I said, taking their shoes off or putting their shoes on. Whatever they were doing at the time, they did the opposite to try to beat me, and they never could.
They never could, right?
Never
And
could.
then a really poignant thing that I read in an interview, you said that for you, the athletics gave an insecure girl confidence. And, I thought that was so important because, prior to basically your generation, this opportunity, this venue of finding confidence wasn't available to so many girls and women. You came along at a time where that was an opportunity. But can you talk about, why you said that and how participating in sports, you really sort of changed your own outlook about yourself?
Yeah, I mentioned the fact that my mom helped integrate the schools in our county. She's called one of the Courageous Four Black teachers thrust into all-white schools as an experiment. And then a year later, the entire school system integrated. That year was my first grade year. And I went to school with my mother that year. And she integrated yet another school as the only Black teacher. And I was the only Black student at that elementary school. And so it was a couple years later, and I was at a different elementary school, actually, because we'd moved, but at Neabsco, and we had field day, which all kids loved. And I'd run something around the whole field that was akin to a 400-meter race. And this teacher comes running up to me afterwards, and she says, "Benita, you run like a gazelle." And I was thinking about this the other day, and I thought to myself, that was probably the first time I really felt seen by someone outside of my loving family. My younger sister, my parents, and aunts and uncles, and all those people, of course, adored me. But outside of that, I had all kinds of issues, either with the white kids at school or at that time, Black kids in my neighborhood. And then, of course, we moved to an integrated neighborhood, and didn't have those same problems, but I still had problems just fitting in. And that teacher saying that to me just lit a spark. And I also won the broad jump. It was the first time I was in the newspaper that week. And it was 3 years later before Gwen Washington said to me, "Benita, you should come out for the track team." But it did give me the courage to try new things, right? So, and my parents were behind me in that. So if I wanted to try violin, I did that. If I wanted to try gymnastics or softball, not very good, but my parents were still sending me to get lessons or put me on the team anyway. But once I found track and field in 7th grade, that was fall of 7th grade. They didn't have girls track the same time as boys track. But I became first chair flute. I became a better student. I was student of the year by the time I finished 8th grade in middle school. Great grades, first year flute, champion athlete. And I never looked back. I mean, the confidence that I got in 7th and 8th grade that really sparked as an athlete, that turned everything else around for me. And that's the confidence I still rely on today. It's the gift that keeps on giving.
No, that's great. That's great. Judy, you mentioned something earlier. You said, in your pioneering positions, that it wasn't so as much important to be the first, but to not be the last. And that's a lot to put on one person, not only to do your job as the first, but also to feel a sense of responsibility or obligation to help lift other people up. How did you manage that? I know that in working for Candace Lee here at Vanderbilt, being the first woman AD in the SEC, the first Black woman AD in the SEC, that she has a lot of people asking for her time, asking her to mentor them. And of course, she loves to do it, but there's only so much that one person can do, and ideally that responsibility would be spread out a little bit more if there were more people put into these positions. But how did you manage that aspect of doing your job, but also helping others?
I viewed it as an opportunity, and an opportunity that I needed to make a full commitment. And interestingly, when I first became director of athletics, women were participating in the AIAW, the Association of Intercollegiate Athletics for Women, not the NCAA. At that point, the NCAA didn't want to have anything to do with women's athletics. As women's athletics grew and they saw that there was this great potential, the NCAA changed their tone. People are amazed that it's really only been since 1981 that the NCAA has been sponsoring championships for women. And look how far the women athletes have come. Not necessarily how far women's athletics has come, but look at the quality of female athletes today. And I have so many people who say to me, I love watching women's sports. It's more exciting than men's sports. It's not all this slam dunk stuff, but you can see the strategies unfold. And I think that's really a testament to the women athletes. When you give them the opportunity, then they're going to seize it and they're going to grow and they're going to reach their potential. So in respect to what was happening with me, when the NCAA started sponsoring women's championships, because I was one of the few women who were overseeing a combined men's and women's athletics program, I was invited to be on several NCAA committees, which ultimately led to my involvement with the governance process and becoming NCAA membership president. As a result of that, I was able to make full-time commitment to UCSD athletics, as well as making sure that I had influence within the NCAA. So I would attend meetings for the NCAA in Kansas City at the time. I'd get off the plane in San Diego at 9:00 at night, and I'd drive to the university to make sure that I was going to be well prepared the next day. I knew who was paying my salary, and I wanted to make sure that people at UCSD knew that I was aware of that, and that really my full-time commitment was to having a successful experience for the men and women at UCSD.
Okay. And Doug, Judy just mentioned AIAW, which is a big part of my book also. And I know that in that period between women's sports being administered by the AIAW and being taken over by the NCAA, there were a lot of women athletic leaders who were skeptical, of this and understood that there would be a loss of opportunity, as it was seen by men, that there was some money going into women's sports, that all of a sudden you'd have men coaching women's teams, or these women's athletic director positions going away. I know Kit was vice president of AIAW. What was her feeling during that time, and what did she see as the value of AIAW, and maybe her thoughts about the transition to the NCAA?
Yeah, she fought for AIAW. Andrew, Wisconsin came into the fold a year later. It wasn't, not every school jumped right away from one to the other. I think Judy hit on this. There was real concern that with a merger, men's and women's athletics departments that had been separate at many schools would be merged, and that the person chosen to be the top administrator of the merged departments would not be a woman. It would be the male. And sad to say, and Judy can tell me if I'm right on this again, but I'm pretty sure that happened. And so, in fact, women lost administrative positions. We've had some excellent examples of schools where women leaders in athletics currently are there. But I think we have to be honest. In the Big Five conferences, it's still, I think you can count on one hand, or certainly on two, how many athletic departments are run by women. Have women at the head. I will say that Terry Golick, who was an assistant at Wisconsin, did go out to Idaho recently and is head of both men's and women's athletics. So, it happens, but it was money. There's a great quote that I'm using more and more all the time now, which is, I don't know what the question is, but the answer is money. And that was it with the NCAA and AIAW. I think it was the women's basketball tournament got a major television contract for the first time in 1980 or 81. And sure enough, the NCAA sees those dollars, low six figures as it may have been at the time, and all of a sudden they got interested.
Okay. In reading about the arguments during the passage of Title IX, and advocates for women's athletics would say, if we're going to say that the lessons of sports like teamwork and competition and, drive towards a goal are important for boys, then those are equally important lessons for girls. And Benita, you've gone on to great success in business, completely separate from your career as a hurdler. But, what are the lessons from your participation in athletics that you do feel have been valuable to your life outside of sports?
One that is really near and dear to me is a lesson I learned right before I won my gold medal. I had been training at University of Tennessee, and it was a hot summer day, and I was sitting on the track with my teammates and thinking about the games coming up in a few weeks. And I had been, when I'd go to the first ever World Championships was the year before, and I'd gotten 8th place in the final. And so it was the end of the long indoor and outdoor collegiate season. And then I had to run all summer, and then the outdoor championships, World Championships. And so I knew that I was not in peak condition there, but it was still disappointing nonetheless. And then people say, well, you were 8th fastest in the world. It's not anything to be ashamed of. But at the same time, I wanted better. But in the past, because there were so many women from Eastern Bloc countries who cheated, they were on performance enhancing drugs, I would go to a world competition and I would think to myself, I hope I PR, I hope I make the final, I hope I, run a record of some kind, but not necessarily in my mind thinking about winning the gold medal. And sitting there on that track that day, I thought to myself, why not me? Why am I always thinking about somebody else is going to win? Someone else is going to get to the victory stand. Someone else is going to cross the finish line first. Why not me? So that's the biggest lesson I learned for myself, is asking myself that question. And when I'm faced with a new opportunity, as I am and have been quite often, a new challenge in a current job or a new opportunity in a different role, and I think to myself, gosh, I don't know if I can really do that. You start having those same stupid voices coming in my head. I think, no, why not me? I can do this. I'm experienced leader. I'm good at business. I can run this organization, or I can do this, take on this challenge. And I challenge myself to do more and do that, because I keep asking myself that question.
That's great. Judy, do you have any stories in that regard about lessons you took from your time as an athlete that you carried over into your career as an administrator?
Well, I don't know if my career as an athlete provided a lot of opportunities other than don't let people tell you no. So I was labeled a tomboy. I had 2 older brothers. I'm the only girl in the family. They're anticipating that I'm going to be a girly girl because they already have the 2 boys. They weren't real excited about me preferring sports to playing girl games. When I was in grade school, there was a separate playground for the boys and a separate playground for the girls. And the boys had all the balls and sports equipment, and the girls on their playground had jump ropes and hopscotch, and the big sport was foursquare. So I learned that it's really important to do what you love and don't let people tell you that it's not appropriate for you to participate in something that maybe in their mind you shouldn't be participating in.
I wanted to ask you all whether, Benita and Judy, whether you have considered yourselves feminists over the years. And when I was reading or researching this book on the Olympic basketball team, I was struck by, at least in the 1970s, sort of a disconnect between the leading feminists in the country at that time and the top athletes. They didn't really operate in similar circles. Pat Summitt and some of the other players on the team would say, I don't necessarily consider myself a feminist. I think they felt that they had a difficult enough existence without another reason for men maybe to denigrate them, or some cases to question their sexuality. Feminists were on record as saying, who are more in the political realm, they weren't really interested in athletics. That was a part of sort of men's life that they felt was a detrimental part of American culture. Judy, how did you deal with that dynamic over the years? How did you identify yourself? And did you always feel comfortable identifying maybe with political movements, or did that make your life harder as an athletic director?
First of all, we need to recognize that there's misunderstanding of what the word feminist means. I think if you look in the dictionary, you're going to find various definitions, some that suggest a negative connotation. To me, being a feminist is somebody who speaks up about equal opportunity, about inclusion, not being shy about trying to allow for opportunities for everyone. So I'm not ashamed to say that I would consider myself to be a feminist. And it was really important for women in the 70s to speak up, not just for athletics. Title IX wasn't an athletics law. Title IX was about educational opportunities. And the reason athletics became such a visible part of Title IX was because athletics was so far behind when Title IX became law, as was medical school, as was law school, as was engineering, and engineering still is far behind. But the number of women in medical school and law school is close to 50%, if not more, when prior to Title IX, there were caps of maybe 5% of the class were women. And I think all of that ties into the movement of striving for equity for all.
Mm-hmm. And Benita, you were really most active as an athlete in the 1980s, which, listening to Harry Edwards, he talks about different waves of the Black athlete, and athlete activism. The 80s, it wasn't the 60s, it wasn't today where athletes have social media platforms and can speak out on issues and, have an audience built in. How did you and members of your generation sort of approach the political aspects of being a woman or a Black woman athlete?
I think we were in a bit of a honeymoon period to some degree. It was post Title IX. I was fortunate enough to both run for NAIW and the NCAA when I was in college, and so we got that opportunity, which was new and great. We also the Amateur Sports Act was passed in 1978, which dismantled the AAU and gave autonomy to each national governing body. And when that happened with USA Track and Field, that started the idea of amateur athletes not having to be amateur in order to compete in the Olympics. And so the latter part of my career, mid to latter part of my career, I was able to make money running track. And so that was also a new and great thing. So the 80s for track athletes, I think, were a bit of a heyday. I mean, that's Carl Lewis and Jackie Joyner-Kersee and FloJo and Evelyn Ashford and Edwin Moses. And, I could go on. And so we were we were experiencing a really great time. I was on television probably every weekend in a track meet somewhere in the U.S. Track and field was in many cases more popular than the NBA in sports at that time. So yeah, I felt like I got my college degree on a full athletic scholarship in engineering, by the way, Judy. Industrial engineering is my undergraduate degree. And so I felt like the world was my oyster, actually.
That's awesome. Well, we're coming up against the end of our time here. I want to come back to each of you with one final question. But Doug, what else would you like people to know about Kit Saunders, her legacy? And if people are interested in learning more about her and your book, how can they find it?
Oh, that's gracious, Andrew. Thank you very much. Can I tell one quick story? Not Kit, it's involved with the book. Judy wrote a very gracious foreword to the book, and she talked about the need even today to still be vigilant on the issue of giving our daughters the chances that our sons have. And I recently interviewed Anna Hoffman, who was the U.S. Representative at the Beijing Olympics in ski jumping. She's from Madison. And we spoke a little about my book, and we laughed when I told her that some of these early athletes had said they didn't want us running distances because they were afraid our uteruses would fall out. This is back in the 50s or so. It's just ridiculous. But Anna said, well, in the ski jumping competition, they have a big jump and a smaller jump. And at the Olympics now, the women only go off. The men jump two jumps. The women go off one jump, the smaller jump. And Anna said, one of my favorite quotes in 50 years of journalism, almost. She said, I've gone off that big jump a lot, and here I am, still intact. So I think that we're not out of the woods yet, if you will. My book about Kit and the rise of women's intercollegiate athletics, it's on all the Amazon and all the. I'd rather folks go to independent bookstores. I appreciate the shout out, though, Andrew.
All right.
I just wanted to say it's come full circle for my family. My daughter is now a freshman at the University of Maryland on a track scholarship. I dropped her off on Friday, so I'm a bit still salty about the fact that I don't have my daughter at home with me. But yeah, it's come full circle, and to see the wonderful opportunities that she has. We went to go to the varsity room and pick up her all the swag that she got from the athletic department, and moved her into this great dorm. It's just the women athletes at Maryland are treated quite well, and I'm just happy to see it. I know there's still a lot of room to go with Title IX and true equality. There's still 1 million fewer opportunities for high school girls. There's still women coaches are half now what they were when Title IX was passed. Women coaches, coaching women's sports, and we talked about the dearth of women in administrative roles. So I've been painting a rosy picture for myself, but I know there's still a lot of work to do.
Benita, I'll ask you one final question, then I'll come to you, Judy, to close us out. But Benita, can you educate us on what you're doing now in terms of youth sports development?
Oh, yeah. I work for League Apps, and they're a youth sports technology platform, and I'm the VP of Community and Impact, and I run essentially their foundation called Fun Play. And we give away the software to sports-based youth development organizations. So we're trying to, equip organizations that are providing free and reduced cost sports programming to kids in underserved communities. And we've done that, 300,000 times already. And it's really great to have served that many kids.
Oh, that's terrific. Great work. And Judy, I know in your consulting on Title IX, I've thought of this 50th anniversary as, it's a celebration in some ways, but there's a lot of unfinished business. What do you see as the primary issues that college athletic departments are facing now in terms of complying with Title IX and truly providing equity for women in athletics?
This is the 50th anniversary of Title IX. Hard to believe. A federal law was passed in 1972. How can universities not be complying with a federal law and getting away with that? So what needs to be done? Compliance. And it needs to be a university-wide commitment we're going to talk about Kit's book, your book, Doug, Doing the Right Thing. That's really what it's about, making a commitment to doing the right thing. Equality for all. We can't go another 50 years thinking that this is okay, because it's not okay. I would like to see all universities truly make a commitment to abiding by this 50-year-old law. Demand 9.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Benita, Judy, Doug. This has been a really fascinating session. Thank you to the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation for sponsoring this session. And I hope everyone enjoys the whole Cap Times Idea Fest this year. Thank you for joining us. Take care.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank
for
you.
having us.
All right. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time to do this. We'll be sure to send a link to everyone when it runs.
Great. Thanks again.
Well,
Good to be with everyone.
Yep. You
Great
bet.
to see you guys.
So
take
long.
care. Bye.